Well, that is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, talking about his threat to sue Donald Trump over his plans for tariffs. You can, of course, follow that story on the Sky News website. But right now, you are watching the Politics Hub. Tonight, legal clarity, but no end to political controversy after a landmark Supreme Court ruling on gender. Celebrations from campaigners, including J.K. Rowling, after the court rules what a woman in the UK law refers to. They say it's biological sex. Trans activists say it sets back their cause 20 years. We'll speak to both sides of the debate and ask what the real-world consequences will be. Also tonight, the rate of inflation drops and hopes of interest rate cuts rise. But is the economy heading for trouble later in the year? More pressure on the government over migration after yesterday saw the highest number of people crossing the Channel into the UK so far this year. Sky News understands the Trade Secretary is expected to visit China for trade talks as the Chinese embassy accuses British politicians of arrogance, ignorance and a twisted mindset. And as the Prime Minister settles down to see if his beloved Gunners can get past the mighty Real Madrid tonight, which Prime Ministers have been real fans and who were just shameless glory hunters? For the next hour, you'll have to pick between our two star players, Ranil Jayawardena and Ben Bradshaw. It's Wednesday, I'm Ali Fortescue live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Welcome to Politics Hub. Well, today, the highest court in the land decided the legal definition of a woman. The concept of sex is binary, the court said, and based on biology. It's a question that has absorbed and polarised British politics. There are genuine, sincere, strongly held views on both sides. But let's be honest, where there's been a void, legal uncertainty, that question has become not just about principles, but about politics. And any lack of clarity has been ruthlessly exploited.
And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
And as with so much, a so-called culture war making headlines here has also been playing out even more starkly across the Atlantic.
Female athletes have been forced onto the front lines, and men claiming to be girls have stolen more than 3,500 victories, that's a lot, and invaded more than 11,000 competitions designed for women. But all of that ends today because with this executive order, the war on women's sports is over.
Well, today, politics here gave way to the Supreme Court and a decision that will impact businesses and people up and down the country. But for all the political and legal complexities, fundamentally, this was always about some of the most vulnerable people in our society, people who have very personal experiences on both sides about why the definition of what a woman is matters. We shouldn't lose sight of those people who will be feeling the weight of this judgment today. Our Scotland correspondent, Conor Gillies, has our first report.
We unanimously allow
what is a woman?
the minority, the trans...
Eyes on the answer to that, the central, sensitive question judges at the highest civil court in the land were tasked with answering.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman.
It was a case brought by these campaigners who sought clarity on the law.
How are you feeling?
Absolutely jubilant.
And today at this court came the crescendo.
There's annoyance that we've had to spend so long fighting something that was so clear, and when you heard it spelt out, it is really clear, and that is what the law should be. So it's a vindication.
It has been a noisy, polarising debate stretching back years. The Scottish Parliament's plans to make it easier to change gender were blocked, and controversy swirled around a double rapist housed in a women's jail. But this case was about examining the law and who can enter single-sex spaces.
It does, I think,
damage the case of those who say, well, I identify as female and therefore you should let me into a sport, a safe space or something like that.
There will still be protections for trans people from discrimination, but campaigners say this is an attack on their entire identity.
It feels like we've had our rights taken away. I don't know what value my gender recognition certificate has. What rights does it give me? Is it worth the paper it's printed on? It's not a very glamorous piece of paper, you know, it's literally a piece of paper. Is it, if I ripped it up, would it make a difference to my life now? I just don't know. And it's that that's being ignored as well. It's the judges, we're talking about clarity. If anything, we've got less clarity for the trans community.
Among the reaction, campaigner and author J.K. Rowling. It took 3 extraordinary, tenacious Scottish women, she said, with an army behind them to get this case heard. And in winning, they've protected the rights of women and girls across the UK. The legal question may now be settled, but there are immediate real-world consequences across Scotland, England and Wales. Businesses, organisations, governments and associations will have to digest this judgment and ensure they're operating within the rules. They may think this is a victory, but judges stress there are no winners and no losers. This decision is far from the end of the story. Conor Gillis, Sky News.
Well, the verdict is resonating across Westminster as well. Here's what the UK government said in response. They said, we've always supported the protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex. This ruling brings clarity and confidence for women and service providers such as hospitals, refuges and sports clubs. Single-sex spaces are protected in law and will always be protected by this government. Well, the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, of course a former Equalities Minister who has been very vocal on this issue, said that she welcomed the judgment.
Sex has always meant biological sex, and what we have seen is a lot of people misinterpreting the law. They've had guidelines from all sorts of organisations that actually do not follow the law. So I really welcome this judgment. We need more. We need better clarification in legislation. The Equality Act could be improved. When I was Minister for Equalities, I was working on legislation to actually clarify that sex in the Act meant biological sex. And I think this is really a victory for all of those women who've had to go to court to fight for rights that they already had.
Let's bring in our political correspondent, Serena Barker-Singh, shall we? Serena, is the politics over? Where does this go from here?
Well, this has always been an aggressive and toxic debate in politics, despite politicians calling for a mature and a respectable discussion. And Keir Starmer has even pointed out previously that the trans community is one of the most marginalised and abused communities out there. But there had been pressure building on the government to clarify what the Equality Act meant. That is Westminster legislation, after all, albeit from 2010, but that is what the courts were discussing today, trying to unpack the meaning of originally what MPs and politicians were thinking when they made that. But this dithering from the government means that the court has basically handily done that for them, and UK ministers have welcomed that ruling. So their statement says single-sex spaces are protected in law and will always be protected by the government. I think they're trying to align that judgment today with what was already in their manifesto. But there's no doubt there was internal pressure and chaos in the past over this. You had Rosie Duffield, former Labour MP, very vocal about this. Today, only a handful of MPs ruled against the ruling. So you've got Nadia Whittome, Nottingham East MP, but not that many on the other side as well. You had one MP saying, finally, clarity for all, but not the sort of outpouring of emotion that is really laying under the surface. Now, when I put this to sort of party insiders, they say, today isn't really the day for discussion. MPs are going to watch for how the government responds to this. So what protections are they putting now for trans people in spaces like women's prisons or refuge? That's when sort of public pressure might pile on for backbenchers. I think the interesting point from today, though, is the language that the government are using and Keir Starmer might use in the future. He's had an unsteady words in talking about this, just to talk about his journey. In 2022, he said trans women are women. Then the following year, he said 99.9% of women don't have a penis. Then he said in 2023, when Rosie Duffield stated only women had a cervix, he says she was wrong to do so. And then last year, he says, firstly, a woman is an adult female. Let's clear that one up. I think if you're a trans activist, you'd think that that's a watering down of language. I think today, Keir Starmer has always found he's on firmer ground when there's a legal framework to attach his opinion or his view around. And essentially today, this ruling has given him the language and the cover to shape how he'll speak about it from now on. So I think this legal definition is a gift to Keir Starmer and for the government.
Thank you, Serena. Really interesting. You mentioned there Rosie Duffield. Well, earlier I did speak to the former Labour MP, of course, a high-profile gender-critical voice in Parliament. Now, as we know, she sits as an independent MP. She's been critical of the party over the lack of support that she received after she was threatened over her stance on trans issues. Rosie Duffield, thank you so much for talking to us on the Politics Hub this evening. I'd start with your reaction to the news today.
It just feels like a huge victory for feminists and allies who've been fighting against this lack of clarity for years now.
I wanted to read to you, we've just had this tweet from John McDonnell, who, of course, used to be at the top of the party. He used to be in the Labour Party. He says the court failed to hear the voice of a single trans person may help explain why today's decision lacked humanity and fairness. What do you think of his words?
I think it's a real shame that those who've been in the Labour Party for ages fail to put women's rights at the centre of our political movement. I mean, women are 51% of the population. This ruling doesn't affect trans people in the slightest. It's about women's rights to single-sex spaces, women's rights not to be discriminated against. It literally doesn't change a single thing for trans rights. And that lack of understanding from a senior politician about the law is a little bit worrying, actually.
I guess, you do say it doesn't affect trans people in the slightest. We have heard from transgender people today who do say that they feel alone, and the judge said in the judgment that they are a vulnerable, often harassed minority. Do you have a bit of sympathy with that group today?
It's nothing to do with this ruling, but I've always had sympathy for them. They are protected in the Equality Act, as they always should have been, and trans rights are the same as every other human right, but women have come across the fact that our rights have clashed with men with a gender recognition certificate, and now people who just say that they are women and people who self-identify into women's groups will no longer be allowed to do so.
The judge also said that this wasn't, about victory for either side. I'm kind of interested to hear how you felt watching, champagne corks popping outside court. Do you think that was the right approach?
It's a victory for women like me are always going to be okay. I've got a platform and a good salary and I'm elected by the people in my constituency. But women such as nurses who are discriminated against for simply wanting to get changed in private, women who don't want to be strip searched by biological men, all of the women in prison who don't have the same platform as me, that's a victory. Those are the women I'm really celebrating for.
There's obviously legal clarity today. Do you think that's going to come with political clarity as well?
I hope so. We've already heard the Labour Party sort of trying to backtrack and pretend that they were always on board, which is obviously not the case. So yeah, I hope that all politicians understand that the law has to be stuck to here.
Is there anything, that the Labour Party could say or do that would bring you back into the fold, want to rejoin the Labour Party?
A proper and sort of genuine sorry would be nice, but that isn't going to happen under Keir Starmer's leadership.
I want to talk to you a bit about the practicalities, because I have to say I'm still kind of trying to get my head around this. There's some suggestion now that, trans men, would they be allowed in women's toilets? What's your understanding of how this is going to actually work in practice?
I think the understanding is just that biological sex means biological sex, whether you have a gender recognition certificate or not. So if you want to enter a woman's changing room, then you have to be biologically female. There won't be any fudging. Organisations such as Stonewall, who teach the law to other organisations as they wish it to be, have always been wrong. They've got the guidance wrong. Lots of companies have spent, and councils and government bodies have spent a lot of money to belong to that scheme. They've got it wrong. Their advice is wrong. And those judges have clarified that the Equality Act puts women's biological sex first.
Do you accept, that there are probably going to be complexities and difficulties for small businesses here? I'm thinking about, for example, a small gym, about who they should be allowing in their changing rooms.
There are complexities, but the law has been very clear. So those people can still do what they want to, but they're going to have to face up to the fact that women are going to take them to court potentially, and we're going to win, because the law, we always do actually in all these cases, but the law has just been absolutely made clear that we have the right to challenge those things.
And does the government need to make sure that they enforce this?
Well, it'll be up to legal bodies mostly, but the government should go along with what the law says, because we make the laws. We made the Equality Act in 2010, and all politicians have to adhere to the law and have to understand and interpret it correctly. Yeah.
Do you think we're about to see a kind of broader change in the way that Labour approaches these sorts of issues?
Possibly. I mean, I'd like to think so. Certainly women like me and all of the gender critical so-called feminists who've been very silent, very quiet in Labour and haven't supported me, perhaps they'll feel braver now about speaking up. I'm starting an all-party parliamentary group on women's rights with the Women's Rights Network, and perhaps people should pressure their Labour MP to join that now.
Do you feel like you've got everything you want? Do you think the fight for you is going to continue?
Yeah, I mean, personally, obviously I've been sidelined and ghosted by the Labour Party despite my historic victory in Canterbury, and that's okay. It's not about me, it's about vulnerable women who don't have the kind of privileges and platform that I do have.
And I guess, we've touched on this already, but, say it's about vulnerable women. I guess it's also, as we say, about vulnerable people, transgender people as well, a minority of people. Do you have a message to that side of the debate today?
Yeah, I think they need to know that, of course, they're protected under the Equality Act like they always were, and none of that changes. But men cannot self-identify as women unless they biologically were born a woman, and that's just been clarified. Nothing should change apart from that.
OK, Rosie Duffield, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Rosie Duffield there. Well, let's hear from the other side of the political divide on this. Maggie Chapman, an MSP for the Scottish Greens, joins me from Aberdeen. Thanks so much for joining us on the Politics Hub. Can you just tell us firstly your reaction to that judgment today?
Yeah, so initially my reaction has been one of concern and disappointment. Obviously, it's a very lengthy judgment. There's a lot of detail and some complexity in what was read out in court this morning. So we'll be taking our time to go through that. But I think I am concerned, and the Scottish Greens are concerned about what this might mean for trans people, for the services and facilities that they have been using and have had access to for decades now. So we need to take stock of what's in that judgment. We need to understand what it means for the services that trans people and others rely on every day, because that's not clear. There have been some questions about exactly what that will mean for people who deliver services as well.
So you say it's concerning. Do you think the Supreme Court have got this wrong?
So I think one of the grave concerns that we have with this ruling is that it will embolden people to challenge trans people who have every right to access services, who have the right, as the judge said quite clearly this morning, trans people have protections from discrimination, from harassment. But we know that over the last few years, I've spoken to many trans people. Over the last few years, their lives have become increasingly difficult. They have been blocked from accessing services they need because of people whipping up and being whipped up in what I would describe as a culture war. I think today's judgment only stokes that culture war further.
It's interesting that you say it only stokes the culture war further. I mean, do you think there's any chance it might draw a line under the culture war if it takes away some of the legal uncertainty over what being a woman is?
So if legal decisions drew a line under these kinds of, as I've called it, culture wars, then culture wars wouldn't exist in the way they do. That fundamentally misunderstands how culture wars happen. And I think, earlier you talked about other people's responses to this. The fact that not a single trans person was spoken to, we had a retired judge of 20 years who legally changed her gender. She legally changed her gender 20 years ago, a retired judge with expertise in equalities areas, not allowed to speak to the judges who made the decision today. That does signal that there is something missing. There is something missing in our legal system that doesn't allow the access of trans voices, of people who, let's be frank, make up a very small proportion of our society, but it doesn't allow their voices to be heard. And I think Rosie Duffield earlier talked about her own privilege. I think we need to consider what privilege is embedded in our legal system and how that is maybe failing trans people today.
The judge today did say that transgender people will be protected. Do you take him at his word on that?
So what he said is absolutely right. Yes, there are protections in law for trans people, but those protections have been there since the 2010 Equality Act. And what we have seen is attacks and violence against trans people escalate over the last few years. So the legal judgment, that what we have written in law doesn't change that kind of culture that I've been talking about. What we need to do is put out that culture war, put out the fires that are fanning that culture war, because trans people have been made more vulnerable. They have been more marginalized in the last few years. We've seen victimization, we've seen vilification increase, and we've seen trans people become, both in perception and in reality, less safe. This judgment today, I don't think draws a line under that at all. And it certainly doesn't prevent things happening. It may offer protections once bad things have happened, once harassment, once discrimination, once bigotry, once assaults have happened. What we need to do is completely change the nature of the debate and say, what do we need to do to minimize harm, to actually keep trans people safe in all of this? Because I've not heard harm or safety talked about at all.
The judge also said that this wasn't about victory for either side. I'm kind of interested to hear how you felt when you saw the celebrations outside court, champagne corks popping. Did you think that was appropriate?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear that one side was taking this and has taken this as a victory. And I think what's increasingly been clear for those of us who've been talking about rights across the spectrum is that so many trans people have been targeted. It's almost like any and all trans people are cast as a threat to women, as a threat to women's rights. That's just not the case. And we wouldn't accept that blanket targeting, that blanket judgment, casting of any group of people in the same way as trans people have been cast as a threat. We wouldn't accept that for other groups. So we shouldn't accept it for trans people. And I think the celebrations that happened outside the court today, they are indicative of groups of people that aren't going to stop now. They aren't going to be satisfied with today's ruling. We know that there are individuals and there are groups who actually want to roll back even further. They want to get rid of the Gender Recognition Act from 2004. People have said that. We know that's a threat to trans people. And I think today's ruling just emboldens those views.
OK, Maggie Chapman from the Scottish Greens, thanks so much for talking to us on the Politics Hub this evening. Thank you. And that legal ruling is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the chief political correspondent of The Times, Aubrey Allegretti, and the Whitehall editor of the Daily Mail, Claire Ellicott. Well, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former Conservative Minister, Ranil Jayawardena, and the former Labour Culture Secretary, Ben Bradshaw. I should say, your former Environment Secretary, weren't you?
Indeed.
Thank you so much both for joining us on what feels like a really important day. Ben, I'm really interested to hear your reaction to everything today first.
Well, I can understand why trans people and their families may feel concerned about this, not least because of what's going on in America. But I listened to the judgment really carefully, and particularly the words of Lord Justice Hodge. He went out of his way to say that this wasn't a victory for one side or the other. And he also, as you said, went out of his way to make the point that the ruling does not detract in any way, weaken or reduce the protections and rights of trans people in the Equality Act. So I think both sides are rather overreacting to this. I think we have to wait and see what happens on the ground. And crucially, how the government, public and private bodies actually respond to it, and before we can really reach a judgment as to the practical consequences for trans people and for women of this judgment.
Is that fair? Do you think both sides overreacting?
Well, look, I mean, I think the judgment today does provide some clarity to everyone. And, there have been campaigners on both sides. Both sides have wanted to push law in certain directions. This really does, I think, provide clarity for everyone, including the government, and both my former government and this government now have been in need of that clarity, partly because no one has wanted to draw a line and say this is what a woman is. We heard from Rishi earlier saying at party conference what he thought, but that still didn't change it in law or clarify it in law. Keir Starmer has not been able to clarify what he thought a woman was. And so this provides everyone with some clarity, and I hope that's welcome, because actually this is about people's lives, and everyone has value, and I think it's really important we're clear about that. This is about where the rights of one group conflict potentially with the rights of another, and where you have, for example, nurses having to get changed in the changing room with a male doctor or someone who was male and has presented as female, and where you have a nurse being suspended for calling a transgender paedophile Mr. I'm afraid we slightly lost the plot as a country, and we needed to draw a line, and that's why this judgment's very helpful.
And as you say, it feels like, I'll be honest, I've been trying to sort of work out the actual practicalities of what this means.
Yes,
and I feel like I'm not quite there. Do you...
Well, I think the example you gave to Rosie Duffield, does this mean that a trans men are often a lot more masculine looking and burly than I am, would be forced to use a women's toilet because they are classed as biologically women? I mean, that will lead to all sorts of potential problems. I think what's crucial here is how the government responds, and we have a government, thankfully, that's not interested, in my view, in trying to foment further the culture wars, that believes both in equality for women and in the human rights and equality of LGBT people. And I think what would be very helpful if the government reaffirmed its commitment, for example, to a trans-inclusive ban on conversion therapy last week. If it brought that bill forward very quickly, I think that would give some reassurance to the trans community out there and their families, who I think will be unsettled by this judgment.
And Ranil, what about your party? Do you think they're going to keep trying to land blows on the culture war?
Well, I think it's about stating now what has been deemed to be fact and making sure that the government is held to account on this. So if the government doesn't make clear that what the Scottish Government has been trying to impose should be vetoed, and if it doesn't wish to exercise its veto power, then it's right that the Conservative Party does challenge Labour on this. Keir Starmer himself did say that Rosie Duffield was wrong and should not say that only women have a cervix. He's got to be clear now on what he believes, and if he does believe in this judgment and he believes in the rule of law. And look, I'm not someone who's always agreed with the Supreme Court, but it is a system we have. So if he agrees with it, he's now got to come good in terms of his policy and that of the government today.
Yeah, thank you both. Lots to talk about. Thank you for talking to us on this quite a sensitive issue this evening, but I'm pleased that we've managed to get all sides of the argument across. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, as the Chancellor welcomes a fall in inflation, we'll examine why the good news may be short-lived. And Keir Starmer braces himself for Arsenal versus Real Madrid in the Champions League. We'll ask which Prime Ministers passed the football fan authenticity test.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and 'Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe. Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out. The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here.
In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi. Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Sky News, get the full story first.
Hello, welcome back. UK inflation slowed for a second month in a row in March, thanks to a drop in petrol prices. The Chancellor, of course, welcomed the news, saying it's a sign her plan is working. But as our business and economics correspondent, Paul Kelso, reveals, the positive indicators may be short-lived.
Good news on inflation, at least for now. Let's have a little look at the numbers. This is consumer price inflation. We see that huge spike above 11%. Caused by the war in Ukraine. It's fallen down. What have we learnt? We've learnt that in March it fell to 2.6%. That's down on February and January, still above the Bank of England's target. That's the red line, but encouraging for consumers and even perhaps the Chancellor nonetheless. Let's look at the underlying figures which help tell the story. This is the CPI line I just showed you. The light blue is February, the dark blue the new figure in March. We can see the fall there. Goods inflation also fell. That's less important than services inflation. 80% of the economy is services. Fell 0.3 percentage point services inflation. Now, core inflation too. That strips out volatile elements like fuel and food, and that also fell. That's a key number for the Bank of England. Raises the question, why has inflation been falling? Prices falling? The short answer is fuel prices. Down for petrol and diesel at the pumps. This is crude oil prices, Brent crude. Look at this huge decline in the price of oil in March and April. What caused that? Well, Donald Trump caused that. His threat, now delivered, of tariffs and a trade war has made markets essentially reflect the global economy is going to slow down. Less demand means less need for oil, so the oil price has plunged. Good news in the short term at the pumps, less good news in the long term. So the question is, will this last? I'm afraid the answer to that is no, and this is why. Consumer bills went up in April and they're going to stay high. You can look at some of the categories here. Mobile, TV and broadband, council tax, water bills, all up. Energy prices going up as well. A total, we think, of around £450 for the average household. That's going to push inflation up above 3%. Forecasters think it'll stay there for the rest of the year. So what does that mean for the Bank of England? If inflation is staying high, rates are going to have to stay high, aren't they? Well, that's not what the markets think. This chart shows us what the Bank of England has done. The blue line, so cuts, and we've seen a cut this year, a couple already. The red line is what markets think will happen next. They think there'll now be 4 rate cuts this year, 4 more, not 3. Why? Because they think the banks have to cut to effectively take account of a slowing economy. There's still huge uncertainty about what tariffs mean for the UK. But ultimately, this says markets think the thing that will beat inflation is not the Bank of England, but a slowing economy here and around the world.
You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, the government is accused of failing to stop small boats as the number of channel crossing hits a record high. And China says some British politicians are ignorant and arrogant following allegations over Beijing's hand in the failed British steel negotiations. Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Yesterday saw the highest number of migrants crossing the Channel into the UK so far this year. 705 people made the journey on 12 small boats. It means that nearly 9,000 people have arrived that way so far this year. That's a rise of more than 40% on the same period last year. The government says it's investing in border security in an effort to bring down crossings and has increased returns to their highest level for more than half a decade. The Conservatives, though, say the figures show Labour is failing to deal with the issue. Well, I'm pleased to say our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is with me now. John, I guess, what are the government saying? Why are these numbers so high?
Well, at the end of March, in an interview, Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, admitted that border security was dependent on the weather. Now, you can say these figures are probably bad because we've had very mild weather in fact, almost balmy summer weather the last few days. That figure for yesterday, 705, as you say, is the biggest. There was actually a big number on Saturday as well, 656. And you mentioned the big increase on last year, 42%. That was 6,265. In 2023, it was just under 5,000. So it's up 81% on that figure. Now, as you've said, the Home Office has talked about the various measures that the government is taking, and the Tories, as you can imagine, are on the warpath about this. Let me tell you what the Home Office have said today. They have said, we all want to end dangerous small boat crossings which threaten lives and undermine our border security. And then they've gone on to say, we are introducing tougher enforcement powers with new legislation and intensifying our collaboration with France and other countries who face the same challenges by exploring fresh and innovative measures to dismantle the business models of the criminal smuggling gangs. Now, what are these measures? Well, investing in border security. They're talking about elite training drone pilots. I'm not quite sure what drone pilots are. I thought the whole idea with drones was they didn't have pilots. I don't know. Drone pilots intercepting boats, elite officers increasing, and specialist intelligence units stationed at Dunkirk. So they are taking various measures, but clearly they're not working. Now, the Tories, as you can imagine, have really attacked the government today. Kemi Badenoch has said that she said there's no deterrent whatsoever because they had an agreement with Rwanda, which Labour cancelled. They said they would smash the gangs. Well, we've heard Sir Keir Starmer say that. Nothing has happened. And this all comes actually on a day when there's been talk of a report about plans talks between the UK and France for what's essentially a one-in, one-out scheme. Now, this is something that Robert Jenrick, going back to when he was immigration minister, just persuaded Rishi Sunak to raise with President Macron, and President Macron rejected it. But anyway, today, Chris Philp has talked about yesterday being another day of Labour failure, and he's also said that the crossings are surging, extremists and criminals are slipping through the net, and taxpayers are picking up the bill. He also says that one-in, one-out scheme won't work. So the good news for Yvette Cooper is that I think the weather forecast is terrible for the Easter weekend.
Thank you so much, John Craig, our chief political correspondent, explaining all that. Let's bring Ranil and Ben back in, shall we? It feels like we don't talk about migration. I might be wrong as much as we used to, but it seems to be creeping up the list of issues that people care about.
Well, there's a lot else going on, isn't there? I suspect that reflects the public's view that, look, this government's been elected for a parliamentary term and they'll reach a judgment on how successful it's been on this policy in a bit of time, not after 9 months. It was always going to take time for the government to turn this round. And some of the powers that John just referred to, the new anti-terrorism powers that the government is taking, which will enable it to do things, treat some of these gangs like terrorists and be more effective in enforcement, haven't actually been implemented and come into force yet. So I think by the end of this year, we'll begin to, I think, be able to see patterns that actually mean something rather than after just a few months. And again, with this spectacular weather that we've all been having.
Do you think we're going to see a deal with France? Talk that a one-for-one deal that the Tories wanted might happen under?
Well, look, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. But Labour's record with foreign deals, unfortunately, hasn't been so successful. It was the Conservatives that got the Albania deal in that brought these crossings and the numbers down by a third last year. Obviously, the increase is a concern to everyone. And the Rwanda scheme, if Labour didn't believe it was going to work, they should have kept it in to prove it didn't work, but instead they've scrapped it, and that deterrent that I believe would have been there, and the Conservative Party believe would have been there, has been lost. It's interesting, of course, that other countries like Germany are now looking at doing exactly that. So whether Labour perhaps do this French deal as a first step towards looking at another offshore processing scheme, perhaps with Albania or another third country in Europe, that's something that we'll need to wait and see. But Labour have got to deal with this because whereas reform came for us at the general election, reform are now coming for Labour. And if you look at a lot of the Labour seats in the north of England, it's reform that's going to be really the downfall of a future Labour election.
Do you think the Labour government is worried about losing votes on immigration to reform?
Oh, I think they will be worried if they feel they can't deliver on the promise they made at the election. But I think they will be fairly relaxed about ups and downs during the year. But they'll be frustrated that it takes time to get legislation through Parliament, it takes time to take new powers. But I think they'll be worried by the middle of this term if we're not seeing a significant impact of their new policies and the better cooperation.
And when you say that, you mean like the numbers coming down?
Yeah, the numbers coming down. The numbers, of course, of legal migration have been coming down significantly. But I think, no, if the numbers of illegals are not coming down by the middle of the... or there's not a consistent pattern of reduction by the middle of the Parliament, that's when they'll begin to get worried, because it'll be more difficult for them, I think, to go into the next election saying they've succeeded.
Thank you both. Lots to talk about. We will come back to you very shortly. Now, Sky News understands the Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, is expected to visit China this year to restart trade talks. It comes as Beijing has accused the UK politicians, I should say individual politicians, of arrogance, ignorance and a twisted mindset in the row over British steel. Well, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, has this report.
Keir Starmer and his team wasted no time reaching out to China. He met the President, the Chancellor and other senior ministers have visited. On their minds, economic growth, until the events of last weekend, when British steel was wrested from its Chinese owners, who were accused of running it into the ground. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds, who yesterday rode back on his criticism of China, is expected to visit the country later this year. The Treasury say the UK needs China's resources.
We need to make sure we're encouraging investment from China in the UK. But when it comes to critical infrastructure, when there's foreign investment or foreign involvement from any country in critical infrastructure, that needs the highest level of scrutiny. And that's the balance which the government is taking.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, now embroiled in a tariff war with Donald Trump, is looking for new partnerships, here on a trade tour of Asian countries. As the Chinese embassy issued a stinging rebuke to British MPs they accuse of slandering the country and its companies. A spokesman said, "The anti-China rhetoric of some individual British politicians is extremely absurd, reflecting their arrogance, ignorance and twisted mindset." The government have responded to those comments, saying they'll continue to engage with the second largest economy while being clear-eyed about the risks. But in the background, ministers are discussing whether to designate parts of the Chinese state a national security risk. And some Labour MPs say the rules around Chinese investment in critical sectors simply aren't clear enough.
If we want to stay ahead of our adversaries, we've got to make sure that we're not handing the most advanced technology to our adversaries. We need a clear definition of economic security from the government. We need a clear threat assessment. And we need a clear way in which business and government is going to work together, hand in hand, to keep our country safe in what are now very different and more dangerous times.
Hi. Hi. China experts say the goalposts also keep moving.
Deals that were made 5 to 10 years ago, I really don't think were made in bad faith. It's just that things have changed, both technologically and geopolitically. 20 years ago, smartphones weren't necessarily part of our critical infrastructure, but as technology keeps progressing, that's going to keep changing.
Steel unlikely to be the last test of Britain's openness to Chinese business. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Let's bring Ranil and Ben back in, shall we? Thank you both. Ben, I mean, it feels like there's a bit of a kind of hawks and doves China row brewing in Labour. Do you think that's fair?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I think the overwhelming majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party supports the government's position, which is, China's an important trading partner, the second biggest economy in the world. We welcome Chinese investment in the current economic circumstances, which an earlier report of yours outlined. That's going to be very important. However, we need to guard against risks to important infrastructure, strategic industries and obviously national security. And it's not a terribly different position from the one that the previous Conservative government followed either.
No, it's a bit of it is a difficult line to tread, though, isn't it? I mean, you were in the Trade Department under Boris Johnson, weren't you? How do you think this government's doing? They're talking about the 3 Cs: compete, challenge, cooperate, I think. Is that working?
Well, so, I mean, I think it's encouraging that Labour are continuing the mantra that we set out with regards to China. It is important to recognise the second biggest economy in the world is a partner that we're going to have to work with in some shape or form. But we should be clear-eyed about that. There are risks that come associated with it. And so, what we've seen is that China does act very aggressively, bringing the power of the state alongside the power of its corporations to dump products on markets, forcing domestic players out of business. And it's absolutely critical that the government continues what we started, which is to protect British industry where that takes place. It's not about saying we should be protectionist and stop fair competition, but where the state in China is using its might to put our businesses out of business, then it's right the government should act. And that's the key thing that Jonathan Reynolds needs to be mindful of.
So Jonathan Reynolds, we think, going to Beijing. We've had the trade minister in, I think, Hong Kong this week. We've had the Chancellor there, the Prime Minister talking to President Xi for the first time in 6 years. Are they going too far?
No, engagement's important. I mean, engagement, and particularly in this uncertain world where Trump has thrown everything up in the air and we still don't really know where it's all going to land, I think it would be irresponsible of a government to just sort of retreat into its kind of domestic protectionism, as has just been said, and not discussing and engaging with trading partners around the world, while at the same time staying true to our values, whether it be on human rights or the importance of the things that we've just referred to.
Yeah, definitely a complex relationship. Thank you both so much. We will come back to you. Still to come on the Politics Hub. As Sir Keir Starmer gears up for Arsenal versus Real Madrid in the Champions League, which number 10 residents could claim to be true football fans.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, a landmark decision from the Supreme Court as the country's top judges rule that a woman in UK law refers to biological sex. We'll have reaction from both sides of the debate. Also ahead, we'll hear from the leader of Birmingham City Council as talks to end the bin strike again end without breakthrough. And scientists discover the secret for bowling strike after strike after strike in 10-pin bowling. Stay with us for the science bit. All that and much more on the UK Tonight at 8.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
An enormous explosion has just come down. I think it was a monster just landed in between us.
Hundreds and hundreds of people hoping to get north, ultimately to get to the United States.
It's a border where they're not welcome, yet they keep coming.
We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people, taking them out and putting them into trucks and taking them away.
They make about 50 kilos of fentanyl a week. It's incredibly dangerous and toxic stuff.
There's been an upsurge in deaths. The fighting between the gangs is getting more and more vicious.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades, which is over there.
This is much more like a normal town.
It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. We've been crushed.
Free from wherever you get your news. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. This is real, hardcore emergency medicine. The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world. Sky News, the full story first.
Hundreds of thousands of people have been using the beast for years to traverse Mexico, but it is really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
The Premier League Running is live on NBC and streaming on Peacock, with a crucial fixture in the race for Europe. Saturday, the unrelenting drama heats up as both Aston Villa and Newcastle chase Champions League qualification. An opportunity neither want to squander. This is the Premier League Running, live on NBC and Peacock.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, we know what the Prime Minister is up to tonight, with Arsenal taking on Real Madrid in the quarter-finals of the Champions League. Keir Starmer has made no secret of his support for the Gunners and continues to regularly attend games at the Emirates. But how does his football fandom compare to former residents of Number 10? We have got a quiz for you both, bringing our panel back in. Ranil and Ben. Ben, of course, a former culture secretary, just to remind everyone at home. But look, we're going to look back at some former prime ministers, and we want you to guess, or not guess, tell us which team they were in. Right. Question number 1. Rishi Sunak, here we go. Richmond Town FC, Southampton, LA Galaxy. We know that he...
We both know that one.
This one we know.
OK, what's the answer? B, Southampton. Is that right? That is right. Well done, both. And I should say, Southampton, I think, were relegated last week, so more bad luck for former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Question 2. Which of these is Boris Johnson's team? All the London teams, Oxford United, Henley Town FC.
Well, knowing that Boris is a great diplomat, all the London team seems very Boris, but I don't know.
Ben, what do you think?
Well, I think Boris Johnson probably cared about football even less than me, and knew even less, so I've got absolutely no idea. And whichever he chose, I don't think would have been genuine.
OK, let's go for all the London teams. That is right. Yeah, I think kind of typical Boris, didn't really want to offend anyone and hedge his bets when he was wanted to be Mayor of London. So, yeah, that's right. All the London teams was Boris Johnson's diplomatic answer. Theresa May, I don't think she was a big football fan, but the options are West Brom, AFC Wimbledon, MK Dons. Any guesses?
Absolutely no idea. Wimbledon, is that where she was brought up?
Well, she was a councillor, or no, she was association chairman or something like that there.
This is fantastic knowledge. Yeah, she was a councillor in the Wimbledon area.
I got something right, but
let's have a look. You're actually doing really well. I'm not sure you are 100% on all of these, but AFC Wimbledon is right. Yeah, that's right. She was a councillor in Wimbledon. OK, David Cameron, if only he was here, because it'd be interesting to see if he could get this right. Aston Villa, West Ham, Oxford United.
This is A, but with caveats.
Certainty from Ranil. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, that is right. Aston Villa, of course. I'm sure everyone will remember he famously confused West Ham and Aston Villa when he was speaking at a news conference. Right, Gordon Brown. Celtic, Rochdale, Wraith Rovers.
Well, definitely not Rochdale. That was the scene of a rather more unfortunate incident from memory. Wraith Rovers, I imagine, but I've got no idea. I'm sorry, Gordon.
You're right, actually, Ben. I think we've got 100% so far. Wraith Rovers. That's right. Tony Blair. Sorry, we're going to go on to Tony Blair. Newcastle, Tottenham, Liverpool. What do you think?
I mean, he was the one that was actually keen on football, was it? I think it was Newcastle.
Newcastle is right.
Yeah.
You know what? I think that's a perfect score.
Well,
thank you so
much.
I
amazed
both
myself.
of you. There we go. That is it from the Politics Hub tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Up next, it is UK Tonight with Kamali Melbourne. Thanks so much for watching the Politics Hub.